She is an East LA native with graduated BA in History, Anthropology, and a minor education at UC Riverside under the Belize Valley Archaeological Reconnaissance (BVAR) program. She became a Mesoamerican archaeologist and continues to work in California as a field technician and cultural resource analyst with LSA Associates, Wood PLC, and Paleo West. A lifelong student of Mesoamerican music and culture, she's created international musical performances under Flower Songs Music for all educational levels, including museums, concert halls, universities, symposiums, and conferences. Allegria's goal is to create an educational platform that provides K-12 students ease of access to Mesoamerican history using art history, ethnomusicology, anthropology, and storytelling. So without ado, thank you so much, Allegria. Thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad you all can be here for this. I'm so excited. I haven't seen many of your faces or even seen many of your names on Zoom in a long time. So I'm really happy to see all of you. And with that lovely introduction, without further ado, I'm just going to jump in. My name is Allegria Garcia, and I'm a master's student at Cal State Los Angeles. And I would like to present to you all the role of death in Mexica Aztec music, where I will be showing you an incredible world within the rich universe of Mexica Aztec culture, focusing on a topic that hasn't been talked about very much before, and that is music. So before we begin, I wanted to talk about how I'll be using words that you may not have heard before and what I mean by them. In general, when people mention Mesoamerican people or Mesoamerica as a region, before European contact, they use words like pre-Columbian, pre-Cortesian, pre-Hispanic, pre-Spanish, or conquest. And instead of those words, I'm going to be using the general term pre-Spanish invasion or pre-invasion for short. And I do this in order to fully respect the instruments for what they are and how these Mesoamerican peoples made them, and specifically the Aztecs, that's what we're going to talk about today, and what they would have called them. You know, it's very much like I would not call an African drum a pre-French drum, or a sitar, which is an Indian string instrument from India, a pre-British instrument. You know, what I'm doing, it reflects my research and how I conduct it, where I'm trying to understand the most I can from surrounding myself with all the historic context I can find. And with that out of the way, let's start. So, where is Mesoamerica and how have the Aztec been painted? So Mesoamerica is the historic and cultural region of many indigenous peoples of these present countries: Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and northern Costa Rica. Today, we'll be talking about the Aztec civilization, one I'm sure many of us have heard of or know some things about. So first off, we're going to ignore all the pop culture references that has been circulated about the Aztec culture and focus on the close relationship the Aztecs in general had with death. You know, I don't want to perpetuate the death-mongering sacrificial reputation that they have. And even if you are aware of it, you know, put that away just for a second, because it's still not a clear enough picture of how important their music was to them and how music and death were so close together. So what I am going to focus on is the execution of music when related to death in Aztec culture. And this will help evaluate the incredible music culture and develop a better understanding of how they conducted their rituals. And I'll be looking at two things. So what musical concepts did they employ, and what actions through song and performance did they take in order to bring these musical concepts to life? So what did they look like? What did they sound like, and how do we know? So not everyone has seen or heard of these instruments or of Mesoamerican music. Further, not anyone has ever seen it played to the best of its ability. Pre-invasion, instruments were regarded as sacred, and they were not easily viewed or played unless involved in ceremony, always ritual. So during the Spanish invasion, they were used for war, for both rituals on the battlefield to frighten the enemy, as well as in rituals within the people's empires or homes. So post-invasion, the instruments that were left were either destroyed, hidden, or under very strict rules by the churches, actually. So during the colonial period, there was an intense disregard for their ability to make any kind of pleasing music. And due to how crude they were really dismissed as barbaric instruments. And I love this quote because it generalizes everything that after like over 400 years of colonialism, you know, what it means. So this was published by the General General de las Bellas Artes in their expose on indigenous music in Mexico in 1917. She says, from the remaining exemplars of Aztec instruments preserved in the National Museum of Mexico, we may infer that the music the people during the pre-conquest era was as barbarish and harsh as were the ceremonies at which their music was heard. The lugubrious accompanying music for these ceremonies most undoubtedly had been wild, incoherent, and macabre, since in it was expressed the ferocious passions of the untamed savage. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that a bit more of a fair reputation was invited, and indigenous music was actually sought out for its sound, and they actually made orchestral pieces using these instruments, which I will be showing you right now. So we're going to start with the huehuet, also known as the panhuehuet and the tlapanhuehuet. This is a vertical upright wooden drum that stands on 3 legs with open spaces between them. The huehuet is a smaller version, panhuehuet a little taller, and tlapanhuehuet is the largest one. And it is carved from a single tree trunk and traditionally made out of the huehuet tree. That's where it gets its name from. And they were made with a harder wood in order to get an excellent resonance when the drum was played. And the head of the drum was usually jaguar skin and played with open hands. Today, most people play it with sticks, very similar to taiko drumming in Japan, even though that drum was also originally intended to only play with hands. The Jesuit priest Francisco Javier Calijero in 1780 states, they struck them only with their fingers, but it required infinite dexterity in the strike. The example you see on the right side of your screen is the renowned Malinalco drum. That is from over like 400 years ago, and it was actually played until the late 1800s in a church that was founded, and it features some of the really exemplary, intricate carving befitting this sacred object. And here are some codice references. So again, we wouldn't know as much as we could about anything about Aztec culture, all Mesoamerican cultures, without these codices. And these were these kinds of books that they would feature their culture, their stories, their mythos, everything. And in it, for example, the Codex Mendoza on your left, that's an Aztec musician playing the tlapanhuehuet. You can see how tall it is, almost up to his chest. And you see the spotted skin on top, that's jaguar skin. On your right is from the Codex Berbernicus, an Aztec musician, poet, singer, singing and play with a huehuet. You can notice the smaller size difference. Next, we have the teponazli. This is a horizontal slit drum played alongside the huehuet. They were peas in a pod, they were always together. It has 2 slits on the top, with one thicker than the other, and they are able to make 2 different tones. There were multi-tone teponazlis, sometimes up to 4 slits, giving it a bigger range. And it is hollow underneath for resonance, as you can see in the bottom right-hand picture. And it is very heavy. It's made out of the same kind of wood, also huehuet, and from the huehuet tree, and carved from a log of that tree. And they are played with omaitu. Those are those percussion sticks on the left with the little rubbers on the end. Rubber, or ule in Nahuatl, as it's called, was a naturally producing gum resin that Mesoamericans had been using for thousands of years. From the Museo de Nacional Antropología in Mexico City, this is a stone carving of a teponazli. If you look at its base, that circular ring that it's sitting on, it's resting on something called an ikpali. That circular ring is made out of a tied cloth that would raise the drum from the ground, and that would be its resonator. And for this stone sculpture, it's believed to be the face of Xochipilli, the god of music and song. So I introduced these drums first because they have divine origins. The tlapanhuehuet, the huehuet, and the teponazli has this grand mythos, and it is actually noted in 1571 by Fray Jerónimo de Mendieta that the divine beings, teponazli and huehuet, were visited in the court of the sun by an earthly messenger who sang of the hardships of man. And as the sun turned the messenger away and forbade his other gods to listen, teponazli and huehuet disobeyed, which resulted in their expulsion from heaven to earth in the form of drums. The amount of reverence to these drums is really evident from various Mesoamerican cultures. You know, the Mexica, the Maya, the Toltec, and Zapotec. They would have all known what these drums were, and they would have been treated as living gods in these cultural ceremonies. So to an indigenous Mesoamerican, these instruments would be unmistakable and immediately recognizable as divine entities. And you can see a picture of some Aztec musicians playing it on your left from the Florentine Codex. Now to the breath instruments, we have something called a tatekokoli, which is the shell trumpet. This is a complete conch shell cut on one side, and you played it by blowing air into it and using your hands, or as we found out recently, archaeologically speaking, you would have hollow ceramic tubes glued to the lip of the hole, and you would be able to manipulate the pitch, something like a recorder. And it's often remembered as having a low, piercing tone, and it is extremely resonant. And they were associated with the sea. They would be used as calling to prayer, also the underworld, and the wind god Hecat. And they would be used as announcements to call for prayer or to begin rituals. So the image you see is from the Templo Mayor site, featuring multiple offerings to Tlaloc, the god of rain, including very large ocean offerings. And I love this image so much because of the sheer enormity of that conch shell that that gentleman is holding in your bottom right. That is an artistic rendition, but that is legitimately the size of a conch shell that they had. And the trumpet blower is a kikizoani. And that conch you're seeing is a kikisli, and they are still played today. And it's amazing the skill that these conch shell players would have had in order to start playing these instruments. And I actually wanted to show you an example of it. And this is Steve Touré at the Chivas Jazz Festival. So these conch shells are still being played today in both the traditional and new sense. So I hope this video works. And if not, that will be very disappointing. It's not letting me for some reason, even though I'm sharing computer sound. Well, we'll get back to that later then. I was supposed to have these clips in here, but maybe after the presentation, as we're doing them, I'll be able to show you these in person. I'm trying to figure out why they're not working, but we'll do that later. Hopefully it should just, there we go. So these ceramic flutes, or ocarinas, as they're commonly known, come in a variety of shapes and size, depending on their use and needed pitch level. So flutes were considered sacred and almost akin to sacrifices, as it was common to break flutes as a small or large offering, depending on the ritual. And they can feature anything from flowers, animals, humans and animals dancing, full-sized warriors, and deities, to name a few. And here's one you may or not have heard of, but it is commonly called the Aztec death whistle. I really wanted to show you all the sound of this, but I can't find a decent enough video even to show you. And if you look up the Aztec death whistle, you're going to find a lot of people not really playing it how it's supposed to. And it makes a very dissonant and haunting sound. But getting back to it, the only known ancient death whistle with archaeological context was the one published by Salvador Guillem Arroyo in 1999. And you see on your left here, they were recovered from the hands of the skeleton of a sacrificed 20-year-old man that was found buried in the front of the Hecat wind god temple of Tlatelolco. And this finding reveals that the whistles were associated with the Hecat, the god of the winds, and Mictlantecuhtli, which is the god of death. And you can see them on your right here, side by side, back to back. And this is definitely related to the ritual sacrifice. Many other ancient skeletons were found in this same ceremonial complex of a Hecat. So this is a tlapitzali. I couldn't find an accurate video for how to play this, but I promise you, if you ever want to see it, just email me and I'll send it to you. It was basically a four-chambered, like multi-chambered flute. And just as a human being with two hands, you can play up to 4 to 6 chambered flutes. And it's the most amazing thing you could ever hear. And just like the flutes, there are many various kinds of rattles in different shapes and sizes. So they were made of gourd, ceramics, seed pods, or either human or animal bones. And they were either carried by hand while dancing, performing, or hung on stands to play freely. So here's some examples here. And this is from the Museo de Antropología in Mexico City. There's a cacalashli, which are different types of ceramic rattles. Those are those light brown balls with holes on the left-hand side. And the yoyols, which are rattles made from dried seed pods. And it's really incredible that we still have these artifacts to this day because most of them were destroyed. And here we have the ayotapacalt, which is the freshwater turtle shells. So individually, these are called ayolt, and they would be strung together or resting on a ring so they are suspended. And you can play these with deer antlers, rubber mallets, or with your open hand in like a clapping motion. And they were most likely featured in funeral processions. Again, this would have been a video demonstrating the range of these turtle shells. And they, as you can see, these aren't strung up, but still the resonance would have been there when they were being played. Again, I will try and play this for you all at the end of the presentation. I'm really sorry about that. All right, next we have the omichikawasli. This is a bone rasp made of human femurs and deer shoulder blades. And they would not be loud on their own, so you would have to find a resonator. The Mexica Aztec people were very good at finding resonators. And in this case, they used human skulls. So you would have your rasp, and then you'd place it on your human skull. And then as you held it there, you would strike it in order to make that sound. And we will be talking about this instrument specifically later. So in Mesoamerica at the time of European invasion had just started using metallurgy. So not a lot of these artifacts survived the invasion, but we do know that they were used in either long chains or rows that would allow them to ring freely once touching them. Think of the spacing of wind chimes, essentially, but a completely different sound. And there were also types of gongs and metal plates that would be struck with mallets, either rubber or wooden, depending on the sound that you wanted. And most likely these plates and gongs were incredibly inscribed and fairly large. We don't have a lot of these, unfortunately, mostly because the Spanish melted them down just for the metal alone. And next we have the tetel, which are cave stones. So this isn't really talked about much, but it's very important to note that the Mexica Aztec people and many people in Mesoamerica had a great love for caves and an affinity to them because it symbolized the literal and metaphysical origins where they came from. And so caves being as important as they are, it's theorized that the stalactites, the ceiling ones, and the stalagmites, the ground ones, were played and made to echo throughout the cave. And they were most likely played with sticks in hand, as you see in the photo on your left. That is musician Luis Perez y Shonesli on his Sanctuary of Butterflies documentary, which is coming out soon, that you can hear him play the actual cave stones, and it sounds amazing. And these are actually a lot more commonplace in mankind's history than you would think, because these instruments themselves are technically, they're called lithophones, and they're found all throughout the world in China, Iran, England, and the Americas. And they did not always stay in caves. They would actually be taken out and played tied together. So imagine a xylophone, but made of stones and tied together with a thin rope. And again, I would show you the video, but we will do that later. So you'll actually get to hear what they sound like.
Miss Allegria,
Mm-hmm.
we have a question. I don't know if you want to answer it now or if you want to wait until the end.
Oh, sure. Do we know, I'll address it right now. Do we know what they were playing with these instruments? Are these old songs documented? That's perfect, because after I introduce the instruments, I will be telling you in depth of exactly how they were played and what songs that we do have left, because we do still have them. That was a great question. I'll talk about it very soon, I promise. So we have these additional percussion instruments. You know, there's so many, and for the sake of this presentation, I can't say them all, but this is a pretty cohesive list of what we do have. And also, disclaimer, these instruments are not just Mexica Aztec. Many of these instruments have different names, but are in fact the same instruments that belong to different indigenous groups. So some of these instruments, actually, some of them only belong to one subgroup. Like if you see the picture on your left, those gourds floating in water, those are called yaqui water drums. Those are specifically from the northern Mexican desert. So don't be surprised if something like an Aztec instrument has a Maya version of its own name. And these are just some of the other instruments that I found that I couldn't find pictures of, or not good enough videos to show you, but it's the oyowali, the tzitzili, the coyoli, which are rows of gold and copper alloy bells, the tapapancanaka, the chilitli, which are metal plates and gongs with mallets, and the acatecizli and the acacocoli, which are trumpets they had, made of ceramic and vegetable material. So they would have these trumpets made of gourd material. So why are they carved and made this way? So above are some of the stencils of the carvings on the Malinalco drum that I showed you earlier. This is basically a flat layout of the circular huehue drum. And I wanted to show you what they mean. So what they do is that they are telling a story. They are inscribed with the Aztecs frequently inscribed these instruments with carvings, which symbolically tell what the purpose of the instruments were for. So the significance of these carvings, which Aztec instrument makers inscribed on them, such as the teponazli and the huehuet, they can now be understood by scholars who are deciphering the hieroglyphs used by the Aztecs in their system of picture writing. And they would depict things such as gods, houses, ceremonial objects, and dates even. We have some dates on these instruments. And any given set of carvings may reveal such important details like the exact time and place the instrument was used, the exact part it was to be played in the ceremony, how long it was supposed to sound, and even the exact people who were designated to play on it. And a perfect example is this teponazli that is now featured at the British Museum. It is the face of an owl, which would have been more an omen of death, which very much resonates with how the music would be akin to or tied with sacrifice. So who remembers? So there is no written annotation of the original songs, but there are evidence of oral history and teaching. Although the carvings show a physical story, that can be traced and outlined and studied, the same cannot be said for its music, unfortunately. And what I mean by that is that up to this point in time, we're going to say, there has been no archaeological evidence suggesting that any of this music was written down by the indigenous people. There is actually no written annotation of notes, pitches, or music. The Aztecs possessed no system of music notation, or if they did, none that the Europeans knew anything about. Therefore, the Aztec musicians needed prodigious memories. So music keeping did exist, however, but most likely it was an oral history way of teaching. And if you look at your left, you see these students going into the Calmelcac, or the Telpocali, and the Cuicacali, which are the house of song. They would be taught these songs from a very young age over memorization. So how was music taught? So there is documents that we still do have of songs, but they are not written by indigenous, in the indigenous notation. Instead, you would have something from drum patterns, for example. This is from the Cantares Mexicanos, a 16th century collection of poems and song in Nahuatl. So this would be the colonizers, specifically the monks, would communicate with indigenous people, and they would try and record this history. And that history and their music was recorded in European notation. And it's interesting because in the Cantares Mexicanos, there are drum patterns in the ledger. You see the words and you see these syllables again and again. And they are to, ko, ti, ki, 4 syllables. And to and ko for low tones, and ti and ki for high tones. And to and ti are downbeats, and ko and ki are upbeats. So you would speak the syllables first and then play it on the instruments. And that's how in this case it was written down. So how do we know? How do we think this is a pretty good theory? And that's because it's still practiced today, and many other countries in ancient civilizations used music like this. So in North Indian classical music, for example, you would show them the piece, and then the student would learn to speak it before being allowed to play it. So you would have these 2 drums. So as you see in the corner, these are the tabla. They are 2 sets of drums, and you would play together with your hands, and you would be seated on the floor, just like the gentleman on your left. And each finger on each hand had a specific place that they needed to rest at in order to reach a set of notes. And all of these notes are the sounds that the drum can make, So there would be 8 different sounds. And these would be spoken first. They would keep in time with their hands, and then they would play them once they were spoken. And that's just the theory that I have of how this music tradition would be passed on and how it would be taught, since they weren't allowed to write anything down. And so what were these teaching methods like? So what the codices have told us is that children would have been taught at a young age to schools. All citizens of the Aztec Empire received an education and were taught within the empire, but depending on your social status, that predetermined what school you'd go to. But if you were someone of the lower class, called the Masehualtin, you had agency. You could go to other schools that were reserved for the upper class, for the nobles, called the Pipiltin. And it isn't really clear the intimate details of correcting musicianship, but if you made a mistake, there were some consequences. And making a mistake was either severely punished or punishable by death. And if you played it wrong, it would be considered a great dishonor on the ritual. So, you have the quotes right up there. I'm going to read them out for you. Training of an extremely rigid kind was prerequisite to a career in music, since music itself was thought of as a necessary adjunct to ritual. Absolutely perfect performances, that's what they wanted, such as the most highly trained singers and players could give, and they were constantly demanded. Imperfectly executed rituals were thought to offend rather than to appease the gods, and therefore errors in the performance of the ritual music, such as a missed drum beat, carried a death penalty. So it's very important to know that everyone had this sense of responsibility, because it was integral to get everything done right in order to please the gods. And professional singers and dancers trained at the Kamelkat, the local temple school, and the Tlarikotzon, a special temple caretaker. They acted as teachers of these hymns, and they protected the sacred hymns from those who might employ them to do harm. So let's go forward. So music was always featured with ritual, especially the 20-day festival that occurred during the Aztec calendar, with each cycle being a sacred round. As you can see on your left as an example of the Aztec calendar stone. Every piece of music was composed for a certain time, a certain place, a certain occasion. This religious cycle lasted 260 days, and just as the priests had their omens, the musicians had something appropriate to play on each single festival day. So how we think it sounds, although we don't have a lot of recordings of these songs, what we do have is colonial documentation of these ritual events. So these are testimonies from both pre-invasion and post-invasion ritual. And the music would have been considered polyphonic, dissonant, and very powerful. Those are actual words that the Spaniards described when they heard the music. And they had incredible dexterity. This is a quote from Motolinia in his Memoriales. He was saying by tightening or loosening the skin of the drum, it could be lowered within the limits of a fifth. The players could change its pitch with the changing pitch of the singers, and it served as a counterbass, and they both had a fine sound which carried a great distance. And what did they play and sing about? So this is where we're going to talk about the songs that they sung and show you some examples of their poetry and song. So these poems and song are from what has survived the last couple of centuries, and we're so lucky to have them. We are beyond lucky to have all this information. And if you see on your left, these are actual instruments found in the emperor's palace from the Florentine Codex. So when was music played? Singing and dancing were always prominent features in every public ritual, which occurred every 20 days. And if it was either, it would be either honoring the gods, so these kind of reenacting myths, their sacred mythos, or it would be royal funerals, where the singing masters would create songs and value observance, show the various observances in honor of their gods or historical exploits. And then you had pure pageantry, which is I'll talk about soon. And on your right, you see the El Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. This is where they would reenact the myth of Huitzilopochtli themselves. It must have been accompanied to music. It had to have been accompanied to music. So for reenactment purposes, remember the Johuet and Teponazli myth that we talked about, where those two drums were expelled from the heavens? So you have to remember, there was always this awareness of the sacredness of these instruments and whenever they were played. So, and that was fully realized by every single citizen of the Aztec Empire. If they heard music, it was divine presence. And this is from Fray Andres de Olmos, a Nahuatl grammarian. He's trying to show you, if you want to read it, he's trying to show how they understood that pain that the gods had to go through, and how that these kinds of tones of the drum were made to convey this emotion of these gods giving up their place in heaven to come help humanity express that doleful sadness, especially from that earthly messenger. And in funeral procession, for example, this is specifically for Moctezuma's, the first funeral rites. There's only so much written evidence of how music was used, but here's a key example of how key instruments were used with death. So this is one of those examples. Remember that rasp made of human bone or deer bone from earlier, the Omichikawasli? In this instance, there's written text that Moctezuma first ordered his young soldiers to grab striated deer bones and stroke it during the mourning of these warriors, and it created a doleful music. It was stating that death was not beautiful, but a discord that claimed their warriors. And you have to remember, these were extremely precise rituals that needed to have response singing, everyone keeping rhythm before the bone rasps were struck. And, you know, and you can see this instrument used in other codices as well. For example, in Codex Vendovenensis, Quetzalcoatl is scraping this Omichikawasatli, the deer bone, during funeral ceremonies. You see him facing Xochipilli, and meanwhile he sings a sad song. And this is mentioned by numerous codices as well. And another part for funeral processions, we had the Ayot. Remember the freshwater turtle shells from earlier? This is an entry that depicts the midnight funeral procession of a Tarascan king that died in combat. And it tells how the dead ruler's chief drummer, along with the carpenter in charge of making the royal drums, they marched in this procession with 40 other household officials, some using alligator bones, tortoise shells, and it was called providing fitting music for this actual funerary display. And here's an example of a sacred hymn in the Madrid Codex, where the native wise men recall what they knew about their cultural origins and mention Teotihuacan, the city of the gods. There's a brief poem which they said used to be sung at the city in the presence of those who had died before they were cremated. And this hymn declares that death is a transformation. You know, death was never the end. It was but another step in the life of a person. And the singer had to recognize that through their prayers, through their words, and they fostered this symbiotic relationship with themselves and the spiritual realm. And that connection was seen through ritual, through the sacrifice of the individual, and through the sacrificing of prisoners of war. Even though life was suffering, the Aztec found a variety of means to enjoy life, and mostly by recognizing the fragility of that life. And then for sacred hymns, we had also gods. So besides these testimonies discovered by archaeological research, there are ancient accounts which frequently mention dance and hymns sung on special occasions, always concerning the cult of the gods. For example, after a battle was won, thanks was given for the victory with dances and songs to the appropriate deity. And similar performances with their corresponding rites took place to install an important lord, to ask for rain or good crops, or to evoke an intervention by the gods. Lastly, we have pageantry, which is the dramatization of religion, and this served two purposes, both in uniting the Mexica Aztec as a whole religiously, and which strengthened their bonds and, you know, further strengthened the empire, and the chanting of rhythms, which went through strict forms of action and reinvigorated the life of these ancient myths. These are ancient myths come to life in front of these people, in front of hundreds of thousands of people. And Fray Diego Duran said, a study of the various festivals and sacrifices honored their gods revealed that there was a perpetual cycle of religious drama, which unfolded throughout their year. And it was 18 months of 20 days each, that 20-day ritual. And this would become a perpetual and sacred theater. And they would wear disguises, and they would have these glorious words, and they would have, of course, music. And these hymns were chanted in honor of the gods, especially at religious ceremonies. They were always naming the specific god and expressing thanks for the benefits received from those gods. There was hymns of praise, and they would be sung by the priests and the people, and they would attribute the god's divinity to songs. So songs and the god's divinity were completely tied together. And public performances in pre-Columbian Mexico, as this quote says, as in other ancient cultures, had a religious origin. Sacred and ritualistic celebrations and festivals were the occasion for the beginning drama, and these performances are still done today. So again, the Mexica Aztec had an intricately complex relationship with their music, to the point where it was deeply ingrained in their religious, political, and daily lives. Their incredible talent, creativity, and dedication to the arts reveals not only their affinity with music, but reveals how they understood death through music. They recognized that beyond spoken word and ritual, sound was needed to complete their understanding of life, especially death. The sound that they have made resonates through history and time. And I hope you can take some of it with you today. Through this project, I was able to extensively explore the musical culture of the Mexica Aztec and develop a better, more personal understanding with what role music had in death. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yay!
Fantastic. Bravo.
Thank you.
Good job, Allegria.
I had a question.
Sure, of course.
Can you unshare?
Oh,
Yeah.
that's a demand. I understand.
Well,
I gotcha.
Question is, you mentioned the leopard skin, and you showed the tortoise you know, and we mentioned the owl. So obviously animals were a big part of the symbolism and perhaps inspiration. And I'm wondering if we know if any of the sounds of the nature work their way into the music.
Oh, very much so. We have most of the ocarinas that we have actually either mimic or sound exactly like some of the birds of paradise or birds that they had around them in their area. And I don't have, like, for example, the Aztec death whistle that I was talking about, that legitimately sounds like a jaguar growl. And you can hear it, and it's one of the most haunting things you can ever hear, especially in the middle of a jungle at night and you blow that, or even if you blow that in a symposium or in a conference room, you can hear the jaguar. And same with many of the rasps and like all the the croaking sounds, very similar to frogs as well. So I have no doubt that either they were trying to mimic the sound of nature because nature was very sacred. It was one of the most amazing things that they held very close to their heart, and how they actually try to mimic these sounds. But yeah, I have no doubt that that was that connection with these instruments as well.
Nice, thank you.
In addition to what Ms. Garcia is saying, is also, you have to think about that there are places within either Aztec or other cultures, the discoveries. There are some places where you can literally echo the sound of either flora or fauna. For instance, I know that in Chichen Itza, if you stand in a specific part of the castillo and you clap, it reflects back onto the castillo itself, and it has that sound of the quetzal bird, which is really revered for the Mayans and the Mexicas. So it not only does the flora and fauna affect the way that sounds are done in the instruments, but also other things as well. And while Miss Alegria is looking for the music that she wants to show us, because they're really incredible, I do want to ask everyone's opinion about, like, do you have any questions or do you have any sort of commentary about what she presented?
I'll start.
Yes.
Alegria, one, you did amazing. I loved the imagery that you chose and everything. I've heard you talk about instruments before in our past classes, so it was just wonderful to hear you so confident about it. You always are, but it was wonderful. I want a question is, how many of these instruments have you played? Like, I know your father plays a lot of these instruments, and that's where you learned to have this love for indigenous ancient Mesoamerican music. How many of these instruments do you know how to play or have you played?
Thank you. Well, first off, thank you so much for your comment. Yeah, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I've been playing these instruments with my father since I was 7 years old. Music has always been a part of my life, and I've personally played the flapanhuehue, the huehue, so the actual drums, multiple ocarinas and flutes. I've played some cave stones as well. Now, here's the important part. Did I play them well? That is questionable, but I do know for sure that my father, who's becoming a master of his own in these instruments, I completely promise that any skill level that I have, he has 10 times more of that skill level. But yeah, I love these instruments and the sounds that they make.
Thank you.
Of course. Oh yeah, hi Laura. Oh wait. I actually have one of the videos that I can show you just for a second. I'm sorry they didn't play during the thing. It worked perfectly before, and now it stopped working again. So here, let me share. So this would have been the ayacocot. This is the freshwater turtle shells. So let me just show you that really quick. Tell me if you can hear it. Well, tell me if you can see it first. All right, here we go. Can you hear it?
Yes.
most of these musicians would have been masters of multiple instruments and be able to play them at the same time. My father is very much a one-man band because that is how amazing he is. But most likely these musicians, these indigenous musicians, would have had extensive training in their instruments. They would have known exactly how to play it and what noises, like what sound they wanted as well. You know, they would have been custom made just like that. I have another video, but if anyone has another question, go ahead and ask me.
Laura has a question.
Hi.
Hi.
Allegria. First of all, I want to say you did fantastic.
Thank you.
I just want to know about the cave instruments. When are they played, and how do they differ in the countries that you mentioned in Iran, and have they changed throughout time?
So lithophones are actually really great artifacts to find because they're stone. They don't exactly rot or melt away like normal like normal vegetative material. So most of the stones that have been found, these lithophones, they're either tied up very similar to like a xylophone. So I know in Iran, for example, they found some of these lithophones broken up, but all still together in one place. So it's very clear that they were placed in these scales. And you know, I don't believe they're in chromatic scales. I have to find the exact word for it because there are different scales and pitches at which they can be put in. But they are either found grouped together in musical ceremony. I know for the Mexica Aztec, they find these instruments in caves still. And it's only been very recently, because this is really sacred music and art and work to go into learning these instruments, that they've been finding them outside of that context. But there have been traces of singing stones. You know, they're called singing stones within different like archaeological sites, as well as in codices as well. They mention that, you know, the stones sang. It's not just it's not just an expression. They actually had these stones that cut in a particular way from a specific cave, and with a certain amount of thickness, you know, they made different tones of sounds. And actually, I have that video here for you right now, so I can show it to you. 1 second.
Yes, can you share that video with us, please? Gracias.
Of course, of course. I know. I'm sorry this didn't work earlier. So this is Christopher Garcia playing the singing stones. Here we go. I will go forward. So in this case, he's playing each stone with river cobbles, so it's something that would resonate with the stone, and he's going back and forth, and he's measuring these different pitches, very much like a xylophone. In this case, this is a type of lithophone, but that's not usually how they look like. They usually look like stones tied together, and then with string, and then they would be suspended, so they'd be resonant. So that's usually how they would look and sound like.
Can we see the conch? Can we see the conch shell, the one that you wanted to play at first?
Yes, yeah, I'm trying to pick that up right now, actually, so I can find it. But yeah, I wanted to show you guys the. I wanted to show you Steve Touré. He is he's a blues band guy who actually uses indigenous instruments. I was totally understating his entire music career, but he uses indigenous instruments in his concerts, and he uses it for jazz as well. And this is him at the Chivas Jazz Festival, and I'm going to show you how he uses the conch shells, and most likely how these conch shells would have been used in changing the pitch, as well as how it would have sounded. Especially with what Gabriel was talking about earlier about the architecture, you would have been able to hear this very clearly from wherever you were, because of the architecture, because of the sound, how it was built, because it was made to reverberate these kinds of low tones. So as you can see, depending on his hand movements, how deep his hand goes in, and he can switch them at will, depending on what sound he wants. So this would be the kind of musicianship you would have seen with these instruments. That's a perfect example of someone that has experience with these instruments, what they sound like, what they know they're supposed to sound like, and how they would have been used. And also in mass, it would have been multiple musicians at the same time, so like a tlaponhuehue is loud. That's one person by themselves. Imagine 10 of them. Imagine 30 singers. Imagine 30 conch shell players. So it's that kind of context that, like, most of the Aztec world needs, especially with its ritual, because of how important it is.
Yes, one of the things that is really incredible is to see that we still have some of these remnants, when you see them at different Aztec ceremonies, or, these rituals that are done specifically for, like, Dia de los Muertos, or for El Día de la Virgen de Guadalupe, or other observations. It's really nice to see that there's a continuance, and just like you said, that oral tradition. I myself was able to see something like this a couple of months ago, and the ritual it literally was father and son on the same drum, and it was just really, really awesome. So do we have any other questions from any of the other we have Ms. Dash.
Hey everyone. Hi Allegria, that was wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah? Okay. I had a question. I know that you made mention on the previous question about how maybe certain materials don't survive, and I noticed that the instruments that you gave example were percussion and wind. Do we have any idea if there was string instruments that just didn't get found, or if they didn't last, or if that was just not a kind of instrument that was used?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So actually, this is really recent, which is really fun. So essentially, what they found was, and this was recently due to some research done by the, I'm unfortunately forgetting. Oh, Justin Kerr. He is a ceramicist, actually, and what he was doing in his wonderful spare time and during his research, he was scanning all those layouts of what these ceramics had on, inscribed on their material. So he would be going again and again and again through these kinds of layers and layers. And my father actually reached out to him because my father noticed something on a Mayan ceramic. There was a ring on the top lip of this ceramic. There was a ring of musicians with their instruments, and my dad actually wanted to know, what is that? And he was really confused at what he was looking at. And sure enough, it was one of the only documented instances of a string instrument that was that old, like that of that time period. And what it looked like, they're very big on resonators, so it would have again looked like a gourd. So it would have been like how a gourd looks, like a pumpkin. Imagine a pumpkin cut in half and then dried, so it would have a hard shell on top. So it would have a gourd on the bottom, and then it would have a string going all the way through, and it would have been played with a bow. It would have been played like that, and it would have made a kind of like not like a twinging sound, but I'm trying to find let me see if I can find it for you, because it does still exist. Stuff like that still exists today in Brazil. there are string instruments used, and it was brought from Africa, and it came to Brazil over, and it's called a berimbau, and it is shaped like a bow and arrow, and they play it with a coin, and it's just a string instrument. That is like the kind of string instruments that they use. It's not that they didn't have them. It's that it didn't survive very well, and these are super rare. This is just only recently found within like the last like 5 to 10 years or so, and we haven't found anything archaeologically, but we do have the manuscripts. We have the ceramics. You know, that's the kind of stuff that still survived after.
Any theories on what the string would be?
I know what it is, but I can't remember. I honestly think it was either deer tendon, like it would have been dried and treated as such, because remember they didn't have burden animals, so you know, no cows, no chickens or horses or anything like that. Not that the chicken is a burden animal per se, but you know, they didn't have that at the time, so they would have had to use what they could, which most likely would have been tendons, and they already did have extensive research on the human body, as well as the different physiology of animals as well. So most likely they would have used that expertise to figure out how to get this string material. And if you want, I can send you images of what I just said, as well as my father does a version of playing it where he uses that berimbau, that bow and arrow thing I was talking about, on top of a gourd resonator to make that sound. And I've played it myself. We don't really have a name for that instrument yet, but it exists, I promise you.
Oh, maybe you could drop the link for the video in the chat later.
Oh yeah, I'll do that. That'd be great.
Definitely. And you know, also to add to what Dash is asking, we know that the maguey was used as a part of, you know, to build, you know, the needle was used literally to sew, while the fibers were used to create, you know, clothing or items. And it wouldn't surprise me that they would have thought about using that as a possible source of string material as well, because they were very useful when it comes to that. What's also great is that, you know, you start to see that the addition of instruments and how it changes the music once we have established, you know, the colonization of Mesoamerica by the Spanish, because then you get this whole new different sound, which is a mixture of the indigenous sounds plus European sounds, you know, more specifically in the concheros music that was used, where, you know, the concheros used the body of an armadillo, and, you know, they would shell it out and they would play with strings, you know, because that they didn't think that the guitar was a sacred instrument. So the only way that they would play it was to actually have it made from an armadillo. And now when you see concheros in Calpulis play, you know, the guitar or the mandolin, which is what it is, it has that shape of the armadillo. And because it comes from a conch, they would call them concheros or conchero music, right, Ms. Garcia?
Exactly. And that tradition is still very alive and well today. And it all comes from the same point. It all comes from our ancestors using what they had, knowing what the sounds that they wanted and making that sound come true.
Mr. Lopez has a question. He says, where did they source the conch shells and did they paint them?
Oh, yes. Oh, fantastic question. Yeah, so these conch shells are from all around, all bodies of water. The Aztec Empire at its heyday, bigger than the Roman Empire at its heyday, actually had complete trade route connections to all sources and bodies of water. So you remember where the Tenochtitlan was the capital city of the Aztecs. That's in the middle of that's current Mexico City. Within the empire, and that's, you know, all this territory, you find conch shells from the Belizean coast all the way to the east. You find conch shells all the way from Sonora, all the way to the northwest by Baja California. And these conch shells would have been carved. They would have been painted, as with most of these instruments as well. They would have been carved and or painted. And again, you can see these instruments as well in like the Museo Antropología in Mexico City. If you look at their catalog, you can actually see these instruments still there. and they're incredible. I don't know how they did it. We don't know how they did it. It's incredible that they could go through all this conch shell material, and you know, they made jewelry out of it, and then they actually carved the instrument itself, and it's astounding.
Right, because they were sacred instruments. The idea that they have been painted definitely is something that we can look into or continue to further study. I know that there's an incredible book that Diana Magaloni Kepler wrote about the colors of Mesoamerica, and it's really incredible in how where they were found and how they were used and how were they transcribed onto religious elements or ceremonial elements. I just want to tell you, you know, I thank you so much for participating in this. You know, it's supposed to be a very casual chat, and it just became this incredible academic, you know, which is really great. And for you to give us your time and honoring us with your work is really incredible. On behalf of this collective of art history summer series for 2020, I want to say thank you everybody for taking the time to see something really beautiful, and to know that we can continue to have these conversations and use this platform as a safe space in order to encourage our students, to encourage our colleagues to keep going and to go further. So thank you very much. We will be seeing you next time around in 2 weeks. We'll have another speaker and definitely give you more. So please check out the links, and we will see you all soon. I hope that you have had a wonderful, wonderful time as I have. And I'm going to stop recording, and then we can chat a little bit more if you like, or if you were done, we can definitely you know, talk again. So thank you once again, and I hope that you've had a wonderful time. Gracias.
Thank you.
Yay!